So this thought of a surgeon athlete or an endurance athlete has some very interesting um, uh, how should I say the two groups of us, surgeons, I would say in particular, and then endurance athletes, have a lot in common, and there are parts of it that I think are lessons learned that can be really powerful as you guys go into your practice, and for those of us that are in practice to maybe make some changes that provide us with sustainability and I would say more long-term satisfaction. It would be the ultimate goal. Um, the answer to the question is actually no. You're a spine surgeon, so that does not make you an endurance athlete. But I think there are ways to bring these two worlds together. So if we were to define success, you guys probably all recognize this guy. He's the first round draft, the number one draft pick in the first round for the NBA. But if you were to ask him or ask us how we define success, a lot of times it has to do with the our ability to win games would be him for him, to be the number one draft pick. It could be one thing that he's defining as success. He worked really, really hard to get to a place where he is now the most desired basketball player in the country. And I think it's important for us as we think about success is how do we define that? And then maybe in some ways challenge kind of what we would define as success. Because a lot of times what we use for our margin of success is actually the payoff. So it would be an event. It would be something you can point your finger to. And one of the issues with that is that it kind of discounts the whole process of getting to where you even currently are. So for you guys, for Gotham, Yusuf, and Tim, Nikita, if he's here, but as this month comes to a close, this success may be in your minds have been that day on July 31st when you're done, or August 1st when you're truly independent. And I would challenge that thought of success because so much is about to happen in your life, and I bet you're going to be far more successful than that day. So again, how do we define success as surgeons? Like, what does that mean to us? And do we have similar payoffs that we're using as our marker of success? And as you guys again go out into this world, think about it. I think this is something that you ought to write down because we are very goal-oriented people. So understanding what you define as success, I think, will be really, really important. For an endurance athlete, it may be that you run a marathon at a certain time. If you're a cyclist, it may be that you are able to accomplish certain goals on how far or how fast you can ride, or how far or fast you can climb. So I think defining it is really important. So there is this surgical rat race that happens, and you guys are sort of right in the middle of it, right? There's high school, college, med school, and this is like the educational grind, the knowledge grind, and you're just acquiring, and all the while you have your eye on this idea of residency and usually not fellowship yet, but then you do your ortho and neuro residency and then your fellowship. And at this point, is a really big inflection point in your career because you go from having someone at your side just about always, whether it's a classmate or an attending, and then all of a sudden you have all this independence, and then you end up going to your early years in your practice where there's a lot of learning that happens, and then you get to that mid-career point, and then ultimately, what are you doing, to build a legacy? And that's what I would even say a lot of us are at. So, but when you think about this concept of success, a lot of people focus on the bottom right there on the payoff. But I think there's a lot to be said for performance and for process as we get there, and I'll explain this a little bit more. But the thought that each of these pieces have an important part of how you define success, I think, is really, really, really critical. So when it comes to payoff, I think it's really outcome oriented, right? So you when you work hard, you think about like finishing at the top of your class or getting a certain grade on your step one and two. It's later on you're competing for patients or landing the right job, or at some point, you may be measured by your volume of cases, or personally, you may do it by financial freedom. And so, all these things are part of the sort of the payoff structure. Unfortunately, if that's what we end up, if that's what ends up being the main thing that drives us, it really, it is something that's typically you against someone, and that's not necessarily a great place to be. It's a more of a comparison game, in other words, and I don't think that's the healthiest place to define success. And it's a moment in time, and those moments, they come and go. So when the moment goes, like, what are you left with? And so I think you have to be really careful in defining your successes, because a lot of times it's just you versus others, or it's not necessarily versus for us. Maybe it's just comparison, like how am I doing compared to? And if you get stuck in that comparison game, that is a very windy road to nowhere. So if we think about these little three portions, payoff is like, it's obviously important. I think we all recognize that, but there's something that's important about performance. And what I like about performance is really like taking some time and looking in the mirror. Um, and what it does is it allows you to kind of look at yourself over time. And performance really is a lot more introspective. You say, okay, I got this grade on the test, or, whatever, I did the decompression in this way. Like, this performance would be a little bit more reflective and saying, like, hey, did I perform at my best? Um, and I do think this is very, very healthy, because this allows you for um, uh, uh, iterations of yourself that will keep getting better over time. This is the debrief where you're figuring out, all right, what do I need to do next time to be better at my job? And if you add this performance to your success story, then you're finding yourself continually reevaluating and getting better and better. But the process, honestly, is where the whole meat and potatoes is. And this is the last little triangle. But this is like, honestly, where all the work goes into that payoff. And for us, it would be tactical or technical skill, right? What we're doing in clinic and in the office. It's the fund of knowledge that either you let stay stagnant, or you continue to grow. For an athlete, it ends up being all things, right? It's not only strength and conditioning, but then you have to look at, hey, what am I doing with my sleep patterns? How am I dealing with my nutrition? It's the fundamentals of everything that they do. And I would say for us as surgeons, it's no different. It's the fundamentals of what makes us great at what we do. In some ways, it's a little bit of the daily grind, because these are habits that you have to create, so that when the payoff comes, that you are able to, A, thoroughly enjoy it, B, get to a place that you may not have been able to get had you not really invested in this process. And then the idea here is that you go from a concept of trying to outperform your peers to really to peak performance. And that's the real ticket here, is that you're no longer looking at how you're doing relative to someone else. You're now doing that relative to performance, right? So now you're saying, how am I doing relative to my ideal self? And that, I think, is a much healthier place to be, because you get to actually see your true potential and then unlock it. It is effort dependent, which is great, because there's an equation that we can all look to do this. It does require focus and consistent execution over time. So the good news is that this is something that we can all attain. And then the results is that the performance is better, and then the outcome or the payoff ends up being a lot more desired. So back to this kind of concept, then, as you guys are leaving fellowship, I think one of the issues is right at this point in your careers, there's this feedback loop that kind of has been instilled in you, is that every 4 years something else happens, you attain another goal, and you invest another another 5 years or another 4 years, another year for fellowship. And the feedback loop is going to end here. And all of a sudden, something else is going to take it over. So you're going to have to make adjustments as you transition, because if you try to persist in that lifestyle, it can be destructive. In other words, if you get the itch to leave after 4 years because you're in this loop of every 4 years, everything changing in a dramatic way, it can actually be negative, and that can have a negative effect on your family and your practice and your patients. And I say this because it actually happened to me. I remember being 5 years out and just like I was like, what is going on? What's next? I'm like, I felt like I needed to move on. And the reality of the challenge that I was given was the challenge to double down rather than to look elsewhere. It was to is to really double down where I was. And as my pastor that said that, the grass isn't greener on the other side, it's greener where you water it. And when Kevin told me that, I was like, all right, that makes a ton of sense. And it just needed me to get out of this little odd feedback that I had in my mind. So when it comes to athletes, a lot of us like to do these like high intensity interval training activities. It can be those can be a lot of fun. For us in on the clinical side of things, it would be like spurts of really high intensity and followed by some less intensity, right? So you can be super clinically active for a while or academically productive, and then you kind of let it down, lie down. So it's like a lot of oscillations that you have. And from a standpoint of athletics, hits can have a lot of benefits. You can increase your VO2 max and can lower your resting heart rate. There are metabolic adaptations that happen that are good. And in general, a lot of these things can be really good. But the problem with hit is it's not that sustainable. You don't see that many people that are doing hit workouts for 45 years, right? And so the reason is, this is actually my little journey. I did P90X forever. I don't know if anyone on this video still remembers that. So that was like the home version of Orange Theory. Then there's F45. I did that. I did Orange Theory. Then I got into CrossFit, and then I got into the operating room. So so part of the portion that's not sustainable is because a lot of the activities end up being pretty easy ways to hurt yourself. So I end up having to have a discectomy from that. Homage to Yusuf. So like my journey in 2018, I kind of found the bike. This is Yusuf finding his Peloton. And it was actually a really fun journey. My dad ended up getting sick over COVID, but one of the good things that came with that is that I found my bike. And I bought a bike, had to ship it in from Scottsdale because there was 0 bikes in San Diego. So I found one in Scottsdale from that my cousin hooked me up with a guy. And it's been a fun journey since. But what I've learned is when I went out on the bike, I was sticking around this area right here. I was going hard. And I would remember just leaving the house and then just like trying to max out right at the beginning. And the problem is, you get 15, 20 miles out on your ride and you got nothing left. And those are really long days as you try to work your way home. The reality is, if you really want to be good at some of these endurance sports, you have to be able to stay in a lower zone, and you have to be able to do it for longer amounts of time. And so really what zone 2 training is staying in this aerobic endurance section. So you're actually not exerting that high of an effort, but it's nice to keep you there in that zone between anywhere between 45 minutes and a couple hours is kind of what you're trying to do. So there are some changes that happen when you stay in that zone 2. Probably the hardest thing to do though is to discipline yourself to stay in zone 2, because you don't necessarily always feel like you're working out. Like a lot of times you feel like you want to get that pump after you lift, or when you do a hit workout, you're just like like you feel like you left it all out there, and it only took 45 minutes. That was such a good workout. I feel exhausted, but I feel so good. And we like these sort of quick, hard challenges. And the problem is that you don't get that much healthier over time, or you don't see the physiologic adaptations that you can with zone 2. And with zone 2, what happens is this little sucker here, your mitochondria, those guys start to perform a lot better. So you got to give it fuel and it'll burn. But I would also say, like the engine of a Ferrari, they do need some attention to achieve peak performance. And I would also say that We all have mitochondria, but we are not all Ferraris. So if we look at the dysfunction side of patients that have, that have mitochondria that aren't working well, it's really been linked quite significantly to a lot of different disease states, heart disease, dementia, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, even cancer. And the issue is because your immune system actually is very much linked to your mitochondrial function or dysfunction, and even insulin resistance now has been recently shown to have a lot to do with mitochondrial dysfunction. So you want to increase the quantity of these mitochondria, you want to increase their flexibility, and then you want to increase their efficiency. And if you're able to do that, then you're going to develop a state of health that's significantly better. And this is like the thing that is most critical when it comes to these zone 2 activities, is that you're able to stay in the anaerobic phase for long periods of time. And anaerobic phase means that you're using fat instead of using the glycolysis pathway. So you want to keep your glycogen stores as long as possible, and you want to burn fat as much as you can, because when you get into zone 2, you're burning fat while you're in that zone, but then you maintain that fat burning activity over time throughout the day. The metabolic flexibility, what that actually refers to is your ability to kind of use that fat over glucose, but then also to be able to flip back and forth between the two. And the more flexible your mitochondria, the more you'll be able to do that. And then that's been shown obviously with your main source being fat, again, to generate all the energy that you need rather than glucose. And if they're poorly functioning, you can imagine you're just not using as much fat, and we see what happens with that. And then kind of the meat and potatoes of this section of the talk is that there's epigenetic modification that happens. So if you look at someone like me, I am not built as an endurance athlete. That is absolutely not what my calling was in life. I know that, but I will tell you, over the last 5 years, the modifications that have happened in my body are very like, I feel it. You can see it to a certain extent, but you really feel it. And the interesting thing is that the what can be modified is actually your genetic expression, and I do think that this actually happens in real time. It's because your body's adapting to the stresses that you're putting on it. So it will affect your gene expression. It'll help you regulate your gene expression. There's post-transcriptional things that can happen with microRNAs, and then ultimately it can even express how you express the genes that you have. And in some ways, you're seeing that because your mitochondria are increasing. One of these ways is this cool. I'm going to get really nerdy on you guys, but this is actually super fun because it just shows, hey, if I'm using if I'm using fat or glucose to burn so that I can make more energy, well, we know that that's really important. But the byproduct of doing this is that we always have higher levels of lactate in our system. And so when you have lactate inside your cell, you want to get rid of it, because lactate's what causes soreness and in general, like, it's not healthy for the cell. It changes the pH, etc. And so you get rid of the lactate through this MCT4 channel. And so you go through your glycolysis pathway or fat burning pathway, and you develop lactate. Lactate gets pumped out of the cell. But what's cool is that if you have, over time, if you keep stressing the system, the body will say, hey, it's going to train itself in saying, I can actually use that lactate to create more energy. And so it'll put some of these MCT1 transporters in that will actually transport the lactate back into the cell. And then it's able to, via the mitochondria, produce a bit more ATP and use it as fuel. So you can see here, it's not only getting rid of like the bad free radicals and the hydrogen ions, like you can see over here, which is the stuff that you want to get out of the cell. That all causes cellular damage. But it then is able to recycle the lactate to use it as fuel. So I just think that's kind of like one of these cool epigenetic modifications that happens because of the stresses you put on the system over time, and in a very good way. So and by doing that, you improve your mitochondrial flexibility, and ultimately, if you're at the peak of this, you end up like this guy right here. This is Tadej Pogačar, who's arguably perhaps even one of the best cyclists of all time. But what it means is that you can maintain your efforts for a much longer period. And once you recruit your your type 2 muscle fibers, you're going to start to fatigue, but the rate at which you fatigue is variable. And these guys, they don't fatigue the same way. These guys are able to ride 140 miles and climb 12,000 feet, and then the next day literally just go do it again. And then they're able to do that for 21 out of 23 days. Like, it's an unbelievable feat that these endurance athletes can do. And for us as surgeons, I think there's a lot of parallel things that happen here. If we don't train ourselves correctly, if we don't make the decisions every day that are important in maintaining ourselves, our health, if we don't stay in our zone two, then our ability to perform day in and day out in the operating room with the stresses of our job in the clinic, and if you're in academics and you're writing papers and the stress that comes with that, the world gets overwhelming very quickly, especially as you go home and everything's not as good as it could be at home. So um, your our zone two training is going to be really important. So there is overtraining. I think that's important. It leads to fatigue and soreness. You actually end up becoming not enthusiastic about training, which is odd. You get moody and your motivation lags, and these physical manifestations you just don't feel well. A lot of times people lose weight um, instead of like maintaining. You can get GI issues and have other physiologic secondary effects. But the interesting thing is, like, overtraining. Like, if you look at all this, like if you look at a slide on burnout, it's like all the same stuff. So I do think it's important that we realize that our jobs can push us to a limit where we end up just burning out, and everything is no longer fun, and everything becomes stale. So, in cycling or in running or any other endurance athlete, swimming, you want to exercise below this lactic threshold so that you're not producing a bunch of lactic acid, right? It's okay to produce some, but you don't want to produce a lot. It means staying at 60% of your heart rate, or maybe 60 to 70% of your power. And it means doing that over 45 minutes at minimum, and I would say usually 4 to 5 times a week. Um, Another way to think about it is if you're doing cardio, but you're doing it at a pace where you can have a conversation with another human being. So you have a slightly increased respiratory rate, but you're able to have a conversation. So you're not like going all out where you're just sweating. The cool part about being an endurance athlete is you can measure it, right? There's all kinds of stuff that we use to measure our fitness. You can use the Oura Ring or the Whoop or your Garmin watch or Apple Watch. All these things you're able to use and measure how we do over time. But the question for you then would be, like, what systems are you using for your self-evaluation to understand like how you're doing in this world and in this life and in your career? And this is a question again that you have to sit down and try to help answer for yourself, because it is important that you keep a very realistic view of who you are and what your skill level is. Um, so practically, why would we build zone two? Well, you want to increase your engine, because if you increase your engine, you increase your capacity to live. And this is really, really important. That's where all the adaptations happen. For those of you that run, like, you want to build your zone two so that you can actually go run a marathon. Like, because if you don't, well, then we can't. None of us can just go out and just run a marathon. It's a really difficult feat. And for cyclists, maybe it's riding 100 miles. And for us as spine surgeons, maybe it's like being able to take a week of call and manage life while we do that. And then once the week is over, to not be completely, blasted and ready to quit our jobs, right? So those adaptations do happen over time, and so it's important to build our engine as big as we can so that these things you're able to get through these things. So our certain lifestyle, I think, has a lot of similarities to HIIT training, right? It's a lot of intensity. The training stakes are high, mistakes are unacceptable yet unavoidable. We're always expected to be on. Our days start early and they end late, and there's clinical demands on us that are real, as well as research and academic expectations. So Aristotle said we are what we repeatedly do, and this is really important. And you guys have seen this slide where I talk about forming habits, and it really takes upwards of 2.5 months of doing something every single day to really develop a habit. And well, You guys have been at this for long enough that I'm sure there's habits in there that are going to be a little bit harder to break because for the better part of 2,500 days, you guys have been getting after it. So, and we know that if we have this chronic state of stress, well, then you're shooting out a bunch of fight or flight. But the reality is, it's the chronic stress that really gets to you, and that's when you have these elevated glucocorticoids. And in short bursts is great because it helps you modify your stressful situation, but in the long run, chronic stress is actually not good, and it can have all these negative side effects. And in the world of endurance athletics, if you have a bunch of glucocorticoids, you're actually in a place where you're having a lot more lactate and a lot more free radical formation, which is why this is a really unhealthy state to stay in and can subject you from an immune system to disease states that aren't good. And as surgeons, we try to compensate for a lot of these things. We just got back from Cabo, and we saw some of these behaviors being demonstrated to us, and it's pretty profound when you think about like the what we sort of do as a group. So we come back to this little slide here. I think process is really where the money is, and that's where I want to help you guys get to a place where you're going between process and performance a lot more than you are over to the payoff. And payoff is great because it's kind of the thing that we all look to, but the payoff is really the icing on the cake. It's because of the process and performance that we get to have that. So it's like the stock market's compounding interest over time. So invest early into this process, and you will have a lot more positive effects. And there are modifications that we can do in our lives that come from repetitively having good decisions. And I think it's really important because we need to have these deep reserves in order to handle the stresses in our life. And so, this is a great book by Clayton Christensen. He's a Harvard Business School professor, and he wrote this book called How Will You Measure Your Life? And when it comes to this concept of performance or even process, like he really walked through this. And the three things he said is like, hey, know what your resources are, whether it's your education, your colleagues, mentors, etc. And then know what the process is that's behind that. What you basically what are you doing with those resources? What habits are you forming on the daily? What are these rhythms of life that you are engaging in? And from there, you'll kind of figure out the how of why you're doing what you're doing. And really, the process again is this zone two training. And then ultimately it comes to the why, or who am I? And I think that's probably the biggest take home is if you're defining at the beginning when I said, hey, how do you define success, and write it down? The reality is success has a lot more to do with who you are than where you're going or what you accomplish. And so figuring out who you are and what your character is and writing that down is really important. So to finish it up, to think about something practical as far as like zone two of your life, I think of like rest, restore, connect, and create. And these are things that you can do every day. And it seems like, oh, I got to go do all four every day. The reality is these are baked into our work. And if you recognize them for what they are, then you're actually creating really good habits while you're actually on the job. And I think that's what's really cool. Rest is something that we all have to do, right? We go to sleep. But we can do things like meditation as well that have been shown to have really significant health benefits, and there's some great apps to take you down that path. Sleep, I think, is really important. Just be consistent is the main thing, and try to get as much restorative sleep as possible. Take some naps if you can. And sleep hygiene is really important. Just challenge you guys to look into that. Things like restore is important. Restore, I think of more like the exercise. This is like for me being on the bike. But they can also be other things like just activities with your family, just doing something active with your family. But it can also be things like reading. And I would say reading not within your, what you're doing every day, but outside of your work topics. And then look at activities that are geared towards strengthening your mental health. And then connecting. Connecting means like relationship. And this part is like absolutely critical. I just read the HSS journal just put out a burnout study that they did. And one of the things that they found was most meaningful was the different relationships that you have. But again, the saying that I think there's things that you can do at work, like you can have great relationships at work that automatically build this into it. It's just you have to recognize it for what it is, and like give it the credit and value that it deserves. And then creating, this to me it actually ends up being for me many times the operating room, because I feel like in the operating room I do get to create. You're using your talents for something good, but I would also say you want to do things that are, giving back to your community. But there's other things that you can do on the creative side, and whether it's painting or drawing or writing. And like I said here, I think one of the blessings of our job is that we kind of get to do that all the time. So rest, restore, connect, create are kind of the main things. It's the zone two of life, and recognize what you're doing. Let yourself go deep into this, because you'll build a bigger tank to be able to handle. So here's my little routine. Got my pour over. I don't know if you see me on the screen or not, but here I am drinking it. I do try to read and journal a bit, and then obviously I have a little bit of a problem with bikes. So, but here's the process, performance, payoff. Make sure to remember those key elements, and most importantly is what connects all of these, which is your purpose. And again, write those down. Write down what your purpose is in this world. And as you're going through the different categories here, you'll find a lot more meaning and joy as you go through it. It's a great book. I would challenge you all to read on getting to know yourself. That's one of my favorites. So with that, I'll end and say thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Mundis. I had a question. You talked about building your zone two, and clearly that means that you have to stress the system a little bit to get that to be better. How do you balance that though with that overtraining, right? When does it kind of transition from I'm building my zone two to now, oops, maybe I'm actually overtraining and overdoing it? What are some tips and tricks you think to use to introspectively assess that?
Well, for one, it's actually good for you. Like overtraining is not good, but like stressing the zone two is good, right? You don't want to stay, in other words, let's take your month when you're in practice, right? You're doing all the things that you're supposed to do, and you're doing it well, and you're doing it right, and then all of a sudden you have a week that just beats you down, right? That's actually good, like in an odd way. Like the problem is if you come to a place where you continue the beat down for, then it becomes 2 weeks in a month, and then it becomes 3 weeks in a month. And then your ability to get through that ends up becoming a lot harder, right? So
Hmm.
I would say it just takes introspection, and in our world it gets a little bit difficult because like I'll recognize something, but for me to make a change there's like a 2 to 3 month delay in the day I make a change to when I see the change in my clinical practice,
Hmm.
until I can feel it. So it really does take some time where you're sitting down and thinking about what you're doing. And early on, I would challenge you to do it a lot. Like, be very introspective. Don't necessarily make a ton of changes, but be very realistic about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And you may be able to keep yourself out of that spiraling thing of
Hmm.
death. There is no right answer is the problem, but it's going through life with somebody that really helps it. So have the right relationships, talk to your mentors, give us calls, talk through this, like we've all been there and done that, and have a very broad perspective on all of this. And your
Hmm.
lives will resonate with one of us more than the other, or people from residency, or your peers. But the relationship and communication piece with others is critical. If you find yourself withdrawing, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And then on that note, how what part of our practices we get into taking care of patients on our own? Like, what is that ideal to? It's like way different for you and for Steven than it is for us. And like we are kind of working in your guys' zone too. And then what's that ideal for us? Or do we just have to go out there and experience it to find that practical or
Yeah,
practice?
it's a great question, because you're different than Gotham and Yusuf, right? And your zone twos, they're gonna look different. So it's not prescriptive as much as it's introspective. It's a little bit of a trial and error as well. So it's okay to just trial and error. You know, I see some guys that go out and they like totally retreat. They get rid of this whole medical life that they went through and they just completely disconnect from everything. And in some ways that may be what they needed to do because the trauma of their training was that bad they needed to disconnect. And that's unfortunate. But many are able still to stay connected. But I would just, try different things out. But there are those, that's why I like that rest, restore, connect, create. Like it's pretty simple. Like you just think throughout your day, like, and what elements am I doing those different elements and like just be introspective about it. It just takes a little bit of time to think about it and then to write stuff down. And don't need more than 5 minutes. Like it doesn't take long to do, but it just takes you sitting down to do it. And that's the hardest. That's the hardest piece is because the payoff is not a dollar, right? The payoff is not someone tapping you on the back. So the feedback loop, the positive feedback loop, is not the same as when you are doing something fee for service, right? I do the service, I get this. When you're sitting down doing introspection, doing work on yourself, the payout is the weeks and months and years ahead. It's not necessarily that same time. And so, like developing this, I'm saying these are disciplined habits more than anything. And you guys are really disciplined humans. So it should be an easy transition. But like if you look at Navy SEALs when they're done with their time in service, like a lot of these guys have a hard time, right? It's because they're forced into structure for so long, and then all of a sudden they have no structure at all. And like they're at 38, and they're out on their own, and what did they do? And not just SEALs. It's like anybody in the military that after 20 years gets out. It's like, okay, now what? So I think there's things that happen all over, but the ones that really succeed are the ones that maintain their discipline. And I'm not saying maintaining the same habits, but I am saying maintaining the discipline. So don't sell yourself short. Don't say just because I graduated fellowship, I no longer have to be disciplined in my life. I don't have to. Right now, you have to show up to conference, and you have to go around, and you have to, operate on these days, and you have to go to clinic on these days. And now you get to, and changing your heart to an area of gratitude, and then to a place where you're like, okay, I want to be the best at my job. That means you need peak performance. You need to be the best version of yourself to be the best person at the job. And I think that's the crux of it. Zone two is like it's like work on yourself and just be the best version of yourself that you can be, and your life will reflect that.
I think just adding on that, you guys are used to, like you said, living in his zone two right now, right? Which is really your zone five. So,
10.
right. But then, you're gonna come out and you're gonna be slow at first. Then you're gonna feel like you're not even on the bike, right? You're gonna feel like you're in this zone one, and then you're gonna have these stretches of zone five. So you'll find it, and I don't think I've found it yet, but I'm trying to find it. And it literally does make sense. Like I was in zone one, and then I do these spurts of zone fives twice a month, then 2 weeks a month. And I'm like, and then on my zone 1 weeks, what the hell am I doing? Right. So you'll find that balance, but it takes time. So be patient.
But like even Steven is doing a good job. I just sent out the request for the call schedule for July. He said, Greg, don't put me on at Memorial. And he's making modifications based off of what happened the last month and the month before that. It's like, hey, this is not going to be good for me for this month. So I did put you on, Stephen, but I'm not, we'll scoop up the dates between the providers. So
You're on.
so you're on, but you're not. Just in case you get the schedule and you're like, what the? But those are the modifications that I think are important that you can make at work. But remember, zone two doesn't really necessarily have to do with what you're doing at work, right? My zone two is not what I'm doing at work. My zone two is what I'm doing at home, or what I'm doing in the quiet, or what I'm doing even with you guys sometimes. Zone two is actually cheersing with espressos in between cases. You're connecting, right? You're having meaningful relationship. That is building your zone two. And don't discount those moments that are really, really important. You have to value them. And as you value them, like a lot of this meaning comes to the forefront, which is really where you have sustainability and high job satisfaction. So